Hi, I'm Brenna Frohock. This is my senior capstone project. I'm a communication major with an emphasis in civic engagement. So this is my spring capstone for 2021. I've just entitled this presentation, Joe Exotic Walked so Pete Buttigieg could run for president. This is an examination of how LGBTQ plus politicians navigate their identity through rhetoric. In a bit of an abstract in my paper, like I said, I examined the rhetorical construction of identity of LGBTQ plus politicians. To do that, I'm using two starkly different gay candidates, Joe Exotic and Pete Buttigieg, as case studies to kind of situate their rhetoric within queer theory and literature. So I use some past examples in queer theory to draw parallels between how these two candidates present their identities publicly and the rhetorical acts of passing pointed out by other queer theorists that have been used by US officials in the past. And then I'm going to draw conclusions about how I think these public personae impact the struggle towards gay liberation writ large. And a bit of an introduction about political rhetoric surrounding gay liberation. It is evolved dramatically, even in the last 50 to 75 years. Some significant political markers of change that I note in my paper were the election of Harvey Milk in 1977 in San Francisco. This came after a large influx of gay folks from small rural towns to larger urban areas. And another significant, more recent change that I talk about is the Supreme Court decision to legalize same-sex marriage in Obergefell v. Hodges in 2015. Obviously, that's a long stretch of time in between, but in between that, what we've seen accompanied with this is, visible increases in openly and visibly queer elected officials. And what I've noticed mainly is that our victories have been sort of limited in a way to employment discrimination and military service. And while these are really positive steps, what I note in my paper is that they are mostly focused on acquiring validity for gay identities in the eyes of straight people rather than material equality to improve the lives of gay people. And there's lots of different interpretations as to what gay liberation looks like. To me, in the way that I outline it in my paper, it looks like economic freedom from, capitalism that specifically oppresses gay folks, sexual freedom, both to our sexuality and from sexual violation. Going hand in hand with that, to me, gay liberation would be a freedom from sexual violence and discrimination in all forms for gay people, including from the police. Starting the literature review, the literature around queer politics is always in flux with changes in public opinion and the advancement of queer visibility. So it's become more widely recognized as a result of the political advancements I talked about. Considering the nature of homophobia and how virulent it can be, especially when one is known to be queer or presents in a queer way, it's clear that the audience that LGBTQ plus politicians are talking to is important when they're deciding about how they want to discuss their platforms and also how they want to discuss their identities. And the primary text that I'll touch on in this review is The Pink Herring and the Fourth Persona, J. Edgar Hoover's Sex Crime Panic by Charles Morris, Pete and Peck on Eating Our Own by Reagan Fox, and Representation and Rights, The Impact of LGBT Legislators in Comparative Perspective by Andrew Reynolds. These sort of outline the construction of the rhetoric and the impact that we're talking about. And to sort of go over the main points there, in The Pink Herring and the Fourth Persona, Charles Morris basically argues that the scrutiny that public officials, specifically ones in politics, are under, that scrutiny is met with secrecy. So a rhetorical behavior is developed by public political officials that is dominated by that scrutiny, and that scrutiny requires them to attempt to pass or conceal an aspect of their identity, conceal an aspect of their humanity to achieve what Morris calls an ethos of gender and sexual normalcy. And the figure that he uses and examines in that paper is J. Edgar Hoover, and how he used homophobic rhetoric and even just portrayals of masculinity to separate him from rumors of his queerness. And these were rhetorical acts of passing that he was using. And I argue that Buttigieg and Exotic use some of the same rhetorical strategies, not to pass as not queer, but to pass as not too radical of a queer. One of the good ones is the phrasing I use in my paper. In Pete and Peck, Reagan Fox argues that representation is not enough to sustain a liberation movement, exciting as it may be to witness. So a candidate's queerness does not negate the intersectional privilege that they may have, for example, their whiteness or their benefit from the patriarchy. In Representation and Rights, this basically argues that the presence of LGBTQ plus politicians in itself is a kind of victory. It does, however, raise the question of how much change they're able to do if they're not in a very high public position of power. So I use that to kind of explain why the presence of a gay politician, while very, obviously a great milestone, something incredible to look at, it's something great to witness, is not enough to sustain liberation and to achieve material equality for gay people, especially the gay working class. So the method that I'm using to draw these comparisons, the research question I'm working with is, how do LGBTQ plus politicians navigate and construct their identity rhetorically? How does that impact gay liberation? So that'll help us find what we're looking for, the impact of those constructed identities. So the object is their presentation. So I'll be using ideas from that literature review to link the rhetorical acts of passing used by example, J. Edgar Hoover, to the public identity that Buttigieg and Exotic have created through their campaign platforms. So what I do is a close reading of some campaign speeches, one from Buttigieg, a couple of videos from Exotic, to identify the rhetorical strategies that they use to navigate their queer identities, as well as their nonverbal cues that they use to construct a publicly palatable and therefore electable persona. So talking about Buttigieg, the text in question is a campaign speech from the 2019 Victory Fund Champagne Brunch that took place during the 2020 election. For some context, the LGBT Victory Fund is it's a PAC. It's an LGBT PAC that campaign fundraises to raise money for LGBTQ plus politicians to help fund their campaigns. So for context, the audience is likely a lot of very wealthy, possibly gay people that are likely sponsors of Buttigieg's campaign, likely have more money to contribute if they feel that he has a strong enough campaign and that he's able to win president. The main themes that he brings up are his religious and family identity, his military service, and the importance of gay leadership. And all of this is wrapped up in him sort of discussing his sexuality. And it's interesting because what he does is, this is kind of the infamous speech where he talks about, if there was a pill I could take to have been straight, I would have taken it. But the only policy references that he talks about, even though he gets, really vulnerable with his experience coming out, the only policy references that he mentions are employment discrimination and trans military service. So again, we're seeing, victories that we thought were won, and we're seeing those regurgitated kind of in his campaign. And I argue that more in the conclusion. But essentially he goes for the kind of representation matters standpoint, likely speaking to people who have, a lot more money to give him. In terms of Exotic, the text in question is a series of campaign videos that he made for governor of Oklahoma from the YouTube channel Joe Exotic TV in 2018. The videos show him looking pretty normal for him. He's wearing a fringe leather jacket, tight jeans, a bolo tie. He's got his bleach blonde mullet, a lot of piercings, pacing around a tiger enclosure. And so he off the bat contrasts with Buttigieg in many ways. Even rhetorically, though, he's a lot more colorful and personal with his discussion of his identity. The main themes that I work out from his speeches are his own appearance and vernacular. So he, makes clear that he will not be changing the way that he talks. He will not play into respectability politics by changing that. He also talks a lot about drugs and sex, and he talks a lot about the presence of shame in politics, and how his style of politician is one that is not ashamed of his past having used drugs and had a lot of kinky sex that he describes. And he talks about that in conjunction with his queerness in a way that really contrasts with Buttigieg, who has, never even dated until he was in his 30s, And And then the other thing that Joe Exotic talks about is the working class struggle, but he offers libertarianism as a solution to economic stability for everybody. So right off the bat, a lot of really interesting differences that get played out in a lot more detail in my paper, but those are the main differences. So some conclusions that we can draw from what we're talking about is that just the way that we talk about issues is as important as the issues themselves. So in the struggle for gay liberation, the way that LGBTQ plus elected officials present themselves impacts the policies that they support, but it also impacts gay public opinion on gay rights. So rhetorical acts of passing, I argue in my paper, have just evolved as the audience has, to which politicians project. That's changed. And so the goalposts of acceptable gender and sexual ethos have changed as well. So has the rhetoric, and so has the personae. And so what I argue is that we might be seeing a kind of new gay panic as more other sexual identities and gender identities enter the political sphere. We see more bisexual and transgender people enter the political sphere, and their platforms gain traction. We're seeing new rhetorical construction that reflects different biases and attempts to appeal to different people. So I do argue that politicians still cling to traditional ideals of morality to increase their electability. And this is a cycle that sustains itself. So public discourse creates the socially oppressive standards. Those standards are enforced through public scrutiny, and the behavior that's rendered necessary by the standard reinforces the public rhetoric and the behavior that oppresses. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. And that is all.